So let's see what shows up. Boom, boom, boom.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, Solomon, how are you?
Good. So the way the platform works is that they get the freedom to go in and out of different sessions.
Oh, okay.
So
Just
you
like a
don't get
regular
to know,
meeting, yeah.
you don't get to know the numbers because I'm a registered too. So I'm jumping in and out of all of them as well. But whenever after 1 o'clock, whenever you're ready to get started, the floor is yours to do as you see fit.
Okay, all right, very good.
All
Now,
right.
will I be able to see people? So is this going to be like a Zoom?
Yeah, and in that retrospect, you'll see like how me and you was just talking there on the side. You'll see that, but you won't actually see any faces. But they'll be able to see you. You won't be able to see them.
Okay, all right, very good. And will they be asking their questions in
They can,
chat,
right?
or
So
will
they
they
can eat.
be
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no? Will they be asking their questions in chat, or will they be able to come up to ask the questions?
They will ask them. So it'll either be in the chat or there's also a spot for where it says questions and answers. So Q&A. So they can do it through either one of those spots. But it won't be it won't be. I'm the only one that you can hear.
Okay.
Yeah. So they'll all be typed.
Okay, all right, very good. And last question, I'm looking at the upper right-hand corner and it says 2 of 5. What is 2/5? What does that mean?
So those are moderators. So those two are me and you. And so
Okay,
we can add up to, if it was like a panel discussion, then we could add 3 more people into the panel discussion.
okay, all right, very good.
All right, so I'm going to leave you to it, and whenever you're ready.
Okay, very good. Okay, let's go. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy that we are able to be here today and spend a little bit of time talking about transformative and transforming theological education. I think where I'd like for us to begin is just to spend a little bit of time sharing with you some thoughts about what I think about theological education as a whole and what we need to do in order to transform it. So I think the first thing that we need to recognize is that theological education, and this is across the board, right? This is not just in some institutions and not in other institutions. This is across the board. And what that is theological education as a project, as it currently exists, I think is a colonial project of wealth extraction from the Black community, both the church community as well as the broader community, for the sustenance of European descendant ecclesial and cultural structures. Let me break that down. I think that in its current form, theological education is very welcoming of Black people and Black communities because of the tuition dollars that we bring. I think that there are very many institutions that are welcoming of us because they think that we bring different perspectives and bring additive value. But fundamentally, the project itself, the broader project, is interested in us because of the tuition dollars that we bring. Now, why I say that it's a colonial project is because there's very little inherited wealth within the Black community. So what that means is that the wealth that is, or the way that theological education is paid for is largely through loans and other means. And those dollars become unavailable for Black economic development. They become unavailable for the strengthening of our communities, and they become unavailable for us to use in terms of building larger structures that serve our community. And so that's why I talk about it as a colonial project, because at the end of the day, the legacy of the racial history of modernity is that every political, cultural, and economic structure functions in this same way. So theological education is not unique. It is simply a part of the way that systems within our culture and within our society function to extract the creativity and wealth from Black communities. Now, that's just the way it is, and it's just a fact of existence. So I'm not saying anything that is particularly egregious about theological education, just describing how it functions more often than not. Now, this is not to say that there is no value to the project of theological education for the Black community. I've dedicated my life for the past 30 years to this project because I think that there is value. I think that there are significant ways in which engagement with the rich Christian tradition of theological reflection that stretched back 2,000 years, biblical interpretation, and moral discernment are vital to the health and future of not only our churches, but to our society as a whole. So I think that the project of theological education, even if it is functioning in ways that are not ideal for the Black community, it holds significant promise and provides significant ways for people within the Black community, for our churches, our organizations, and other groups that are dependent upon us to bring the resources of the Christian tradition in ways that help us imagine new futures, motivate new generations, and really work to build a larger society. So we're really talking about something walking a tightrope, that in its functioning, it's problematic, but in terms of its promise, it is vital. So the question for me, as I think about theological education, is how to make an institution or a project serve the needs of our communities if its very design is to participate in the wealth extraction from our communities. So that becomes the big question for me, and it's one I've been trying to grapple with, both in terms of being a professor, a voice in the field of theological education as the seminary president. How do you take a project, how do you take institutions who through their design participate in this larger issue of wealth extraction from the Black community and change that direction so that organizations, institutions, the ways disciplines are created, all of the things that construct theological education, how do you reshape those in ways that it meets the needs of our community even if at the same time it's engaging in what I've described as wealth extraction. To put it theologically, how do we transform the anti-Black dimensions of original sin as it manifests itself in the project of theological education to ways that ameliorate and help us grow in terms of the work that we're doing? So for me, those are the fundamental questions that I would like to spend some time dealing with, and I'd like to engage you with, because I'm just going to say a few things, and then I'd very much like to engage the questions that you have and the thoughts that you have. But before I do that, let me touch on what I think are two strategies for dealing with the issue that I've just raised about theological education, seminaries, divinity schools, as well as Bible colleges and other institutions that deliver theological education. So the two strategies that I want to talk about are: one, shaping it by this: whose questions are these schools, are these organizations seeking to answer? And the second one is whether or not it is possible to engage in this transformation without substantial sort of renegotiation and building of relationships with the Black community in particular, but with other communities as well. So these are two larger questions that I'm focusing today, specifically on issues germane to the Black community and to Black churches, but I think that they are ones that are germane to larger questions as well with other communities. So when I say it's important to be clear about whose questions are being answered, be clear about whose questions are being presumed worthy of answer, and make sure that yours are in the number. Now, what I mean by that is that theological education shapes itself to answer what are the existential questions of the faithful, as well as to answer the questions of the religious organizations that seek to engage those communities. And one of the issues currently in theological education is that very often the questions that are driving biblical interpretation, the questions that are driving ethical reflection, the questions that are driving ministerial formation, the questions that are driving worship are ones that are largely extraneous to very many within the Black community and very many within the Black church. And this is one of the reasons why we find, and I've heard this the entire time I've been in theological education, which is a little bit over 30 years now, this is why we continually hear people who are graduates, and the concern is people say, well, they sound like they've never been to seminary at all, or we're trying to see where the seminary impacted and affected them. Well, it's not an issue of them not learning, and it's not an issue of the students not taking something from their seminary education. It's the reality that they are trying to answer the existential questions of their communities. They're trying to answer the questions of the church community and larger community, and frequently the way that they've learned biblical interpretation, the way that they've learned theological reflection, the way that they've learned how to do ministerial formation and ministerial practice, have treated the specific questions that face the Black community as secondary concern, and more often than not treated the questions and issues that arise in European descended communities as being the ones that are most vital and the point of theological education to begin with. So when we talk about the questions being asked and how we try to answer them, I think I want to talk about two ways that we can look at those. The first, I think, is the existential question which faces Black communities and has done so historically and will continue to do so. And the existential question is this: whether, as the evidence of history would suggest, Black communities and Black people are God-forsaken. And if we are not, then by what means do we know otherwise? So, one of the things that's very clear about Black history is that certainly while we have the creativity and joy that comes from things like Black love, Black joy, Black creativity, we also have a deep history of pain and suffering, dislocation, beginning with not simply the transatlantic slave trade, but the destruction that began of African societies that actually led to the flourishing of that. So if you simply look at the flow of history, it's very hard to say that Black people are beloved of God. If you simply look at historical facts, it's very hard to say that God cares very much about Black people. This was an issue that was raised by William R. Jones in his book back in the 1970s, Is God a White Racist? And it's a question that continually is raised by thinkers, philosophers, theologians like Anthony Penn and others. And I would argue that the entire Black Afro-pessimism movement that has been given rise to in the last decade or so is largely driven by this question, is that if the material evidence of history, the material evidence of our current existence is that we are something other than folk beloved of God, then how is it that church people, Black church people, continue to say to themselves over and over again, out of their own experience, that God does indeed love us, that God does indeed care for us? So when that becomes the center of the questions that theological education is trying to answer, it shapes the entire project. It changes the way that we think about reading the Bible. So the question doesn't become, well, is the Bible true or is the Bible something else? You know, are these simply stories that have been passed down from generations, some of which are true, some of which are myths, some of which are legend? I mean, those are all interesting and esoteric questions, but they don't fundamentally get to the existential question of Black existence. Similarly, when we talk about ecclesiology, which is the study of the church, which is the study of the church in both its being as well as in its way of acting in the world, whose story of the church is authentic? The story of those who have prospered because of the suffering of Black people, beginning with the transatlantic slave trade and moving on through continual periods of exploitation, such as Jim and Jane Crow, and on through the current moment? Or is the story of those who, in spite of their suffering, were able to bear witness to the power of the Spirit in their midst and the power of the Spirit of God, as affirming their humanity in a world that did not? So it changes the way we ask the question. You know, so when we talk about in the philosophy of religion, when we talk about the great sort of syllogism or the great sort of seeming contradiction of saying that if God is all good and if God is all powerful, why is there evil? Well, I mean, that's a question that is largely irrelevant to Black people. The question to Black people and the question that Black people raise and have an answer to is, how is it in the midst of evil, God's goodness still shines through so that we're able to experience our humanity as something that's good and something that's filled with joy? So this is what I mean by, with theological education, it matters whose questions you are focusing on. So I think that as we talk about transforming theological education and creating theological education that is transformative, the first step in the process is to ensure that the questions that are being raised, to which our courses, to which our curriculum see seek to respond are questions that are not simply germane to the Black community and the Black church community, but are actually ones that are authentically being raised and guidance being sought. And I would argue that once we begin to shape theological education in that way, then what we are able to do is we are able to add value and meaning that becomes critically important to the project. And the often spoken issue of how much of their theological education do Black preachers, Black ministers, Black church leaders use will become a question that becomes of little consequence because people will be equipped in every sphere of their formation within seminary to actually answer the questions that Black existence raises, as opposed to providing approximate answers, which largely come from the experience of other communities, particularly communities that are benefiting from our suffering. But I think as well, people will be validated in terms of both the truth and the strength of the communities which have shaped and formed them. Now, I'm not for one moment going to suggest that Black communities, Black church communities are perfect. I mean, we're human beings just like everybody else. We struggle with issues around gender justice, the recognition of women in ministry, the recognition of the gifts of LGBTQ people. I mean, we struggle with things just like everyone else. But what I am suggesting is that even in the midst of those struggles, there is something magnificent that God has done in our midst, and that validating that as a significant witness to the history of the church as such, not just the Black church, but the church as such, becomes critically important. And theological education either does that work or it does work of simply sidelining as another kind of experience and expression what the Black community and Black experience brings. So I think I want to lift that piece up to begin with, is to say that being attentive to the questions that people are raising makes a difference. And I think that also allows us in very significant ways to engage the kinds of cultural and social phenomena that are represented not only in what I mentioned earlier in terms of Afro-pessimism, but also in terms of being able to have a substantially value added voice in movements such as Black Lives Matter and in other movements that are trying to create a different future for generations of Black people to come, rather than the ones that are simply growing behind. And that is so critical for us in these days and times. So both the questions that we're asking in terms of existence and the material question of whose history are we going to celebrate as the authentic history of the church as it ought to be, and not simply the church as it's struggling to be, become critically important. And so that's the first strategy. The second strategy that I just want to take a moment, and then I'd love to engage with you all in terms of questions and just have some dialogue, which we'll be doing in the chat box. So that's where you can begin to put your reactions, or you can begin to put your questions in the chat box, and then we can, I'll answer any questions live that you have, and then we can engage conversation there. I think the second piece that I want to pick up, the second strategy, is to recognize that profound transformation within theological education that reshapes the project so that it becomes transformative requires creative and sustained relationships with living Black communities and people and organizations within that community across the spectrum of faith. And what I mean by that is that in order for theological education to be transformed, it has to take Black people seriously. It has to take us seriously in every form in which we express our humanity, whether or not it is in terms of our church existence, our individual existence, our existence as religious people who are Christian and non Christian, as well as people who don't have any particular sort of confession other than their desire to have a better world. That seminaries, divinity schools, Bible colleges, and other organizations that deliver theological education must develop sustained relationship, because that's what creates transformation in the project itself, as well as allows it to be transformative. One of the things that is often mentioned when we talk about theological education is the reality that in too many expressions of this project, we are always treated as guests in someone else's house. And even though we may be honored guests, it's still very clear that we have no ownership of this house. And a part of what requires transformation is that we become a part of the group whose name is on the deed, and that we're not simply ones who come with a card of invitation. That happens in any number of ways, but it is critical for that to happen. Now, all of these things I've been talking about are strategies and challenges, but transformed theological education, and then I'm going to stop, but transformed theological education is one where you don't simply see more Black faculty, that you don't simply see more Black text in the curriculum. Those are important. Don't get me wrong. I've spent my career trying to make sure that both of those things happen more robustly. But real transformation comes when we talk about whose questions are we building our curriculum around? Not whose questions are we building a course in African American studies around? Whose questions are we trying to answer when we build a course in womanist studies around? But whose questions are we building our entire curriculum around? As well as we see transformation when we begin to see that the school is shaping its life, both in terms of its fundraising work as well as in terms of its administration, around the presumption that Black churches, Black communities are not simply honored guests, but they're actually people who are necessary for us to build a future, which we would desire. So I'm going to pause there and begin to answer some questions, and I'll be happy to make any types of clarifications or anything like that. But those were the two big things that I wanted to share with you, both in terms of a diagnosis of what I think is the challenge before us, as well as some strategies for dealing with it. So I have a couple of questions here. One from LaKesha Womack. And LaKesha, let me just say how thankful I am that you've allowed me this opportunity. So thanks so much, both on my behalf as a presenter, but on behalf of Chicago Theological Seminary as well. So the question is, how do you all create programs that are practical while providing historical context? Why is this so hard for other institutions? Well, I think that, part of what I've tried to touch on is what makes it practical is that you are trying to meet the actual needs of living communities, of concrete communities, so that when you reach back and grab the church's traditions, when you talk about people who shaped what Western Christianity is, people who were the early church theologians, when you recover their thinking, you never just read them for their own sake. You read them to help you understand what it means to be the church today. And so a significant challenge is that it's not hard to make it practical if you're trying to answer the right questions. It's hard to make it practical if the questions you're trying to answer are extraneous to the experience of the people to whom you're talking. So, for instance, there are two things that we talk about in theological education, in administration, and I know on the faculty level. How do you help people gain the skills to do the kind of managerial work that's necessary in the contemporary shape of the church? You know, how do you help them become managers? How do you help them think more critically about money? How do you help them think more critically about how it is that they order their life? Well, one of the things that I have seen in my experience in pastoral ministry and in teaching is that most congregations have more than enough resources to answer those questions. They have people who are good trustees. They have people who are good stewards. They have people who are good in terms of the spiritual care of the church. What they're looking for church leaders to do is to activate that in a way that is theologically sophisticated and that connects them to the broad stream of what the church and spirit are doing in the world today. And so, from my perspective, there are ways in which people need to gain concrete skills, but they also need to gain the most important skill, which is being able to activate people in their congregations who bring those gifts and talents, but who are struggling and yearning to find a way to do that in ways that are faithful and in ways that carry the mission of the church forward. So now that certainly requires that they learn about these things, that they learn about effective administration, effective management. But I think a critical piece is that they don't necessarily have to learn to be CEOs, but what they do need to do is learn how to activate people who can help them do that work. So I think, particularly in terms of the second question that you're raising, LaKesha, that there is a way that business schools can contribute. But once again, what I'd want to suggest is that, at least in my experience, the most successful pastors, and what I mean by successful, I'm not just talking about in terms of numbers or anything like that, but the most successful pastors in terms of having vibrant communities are those who have substantial enough knowledge of what is needed to effectively financially manage the organization, to manage its assets, to manage its building. So they need to have an awareness of being able to diagnose what is needed, but then they need to activate the people in their congregation to do that work and do that work in ways that they find spiritually fulfilling and in ways that they gain new knowledge and sense of who and what they are. So that's the way that I think about that. But once again, if you're not asking or answering the people's existential questions in the first place, then it's very hard to activate them to do this other work. So there's a question from Ann Cohen. Ann, so glad to see you. Ann is former student when I was in Philadelphia teaching at the Lutheran School of Theology there. So thanks, Ann. So good to see you here. Do you think it is time for Black African American and BIPOC people to create our own theological institutions? Well, I think two things, Anne. One is that I think that we have some that we want to celebrate, but I think that it is simply a reality that because of geography and because of history, many of those organizations, historically Black theological institutions, HBTIs as we call them, have a limited scope and limited reach. I think it is critically important that the organizations which have been beneficiaries of the wealth extraction that I was talking about a bit earlier are responsible partners with our communities so that we're getting the things that we need. So while there are certainly some spaces in which we can develop and need to develop new organizations, I think the most critical piece is that we demand and we work and we facilitate to ensure that those organizations, schools, seminaries, etc., that have already been beneficiaries of this wealth extraction are called to accountability in terms of how they are shaping their curriculum, in terms of how they're shaping their administration, in terms of how they're shaping their board of trustees, and in terms of how they are in the world. And in calling them to that responsibility, we'll find two things. There are some schools that simply won't do it because either other things are more important to them or they simply don't feel that they have the capacity. And for those schools, I honestly think that we should stop wasting our time. But there are schools that are available to be transformed, and I think that those need to be worked on as well. So, along with the support of our HBTIs, as well as in terms of looking at new opportunities to create projects that deliver theological education, we also need to, as a community, call people to responsibility for living into what it is that we need, given that they have already been beneficiaries of this wealth extraction from our communities. Okay, let's see. LaKesha, many pastors only go to school to get the paper, but don't invest in their spiritual growth in the program. How do you get pastors to take theological education more seriously for their personal growth? Well, LaKesha, I think that goes back to an earlier point is that once they and the questions of their communities are being taken seriously, then I think there's a level of engagement that you can get from students. And I mean, I've been a witness to this, that you can get from students that their engagement with theological education in seminary and divinity schools is something that will become important to them. But as long as they think that the basic questions, the basic issues that they will be facing every Sunday morning and every day until the next Sunday morning are largely being left unaddressed and unanswered, it's very hard to get people to make that kind of investment. So that's one of the reasons why I began talking about it on this sort of high level, because I think that until people begin to feel that their communities are being taken seriously, it's hard to get that kind of investment. One of the things that Carter G. Woodson wrote about back in 1902 in his book, The Negro Church, was he wrote that the primary thing that ministers who go to school learn, and the one thing that they learn exceedingly well, is to hold the communities which sent them in contempt. And so I think that that's still a reality in many institutions of theological education. And until we change that dynamic, then getting people to invest their spiritual well being in the project becomes very, very difficult. Let's see. Ann, let's jump to your question. It's time for our communities, churches to take theological education by funding like our white counterparts. That's exactly right, and that's what I mean by building partnerships that are sustaining partnerships. Is that we've got to go all in, but we don't have to go all in on institutions that are only going to use our investment as a means to sustain and further the well-being of communities other than ours. So we have to be astute about how we do it. We have to be wise about who we are seeking to partner with. And we have to be able to be clear about what kinds of resources we are mobilizing. But again, we shouldn't begin to think about doing any of that until we are clear that institutions that benefit from that investment have an accountability to the communities from which they are receiving this investment. So I see Solomon has a question. How do you feel about Black church studies being merged with other departments of studies? Well, Solomon, I think that one of the things about Black church studies, and as you all know, I was one of the authors on the project that produced the book, An Introduction to Black Church Studies, which is to date the most substantial text in the field. And I think that it's always a starting point, that it's always critically important for a school to have that, because that becomes a first step. But the next step is the one to raise the question, uh, you know, how is the school, how is theological education doing something more than just adding courses and doing something more than simply adding professors? How is it making the questions that arise from the contemporary Black church community as well as for the historic Black community? How is that being reflected by the way you're shaping the entire curriculum? So what that means is Black church studies can become an anchor to do this other work, but I don't think it should ever be viewed as anything more than an anchor. Because if it becomes more than an anchor, it becomes a way for seminaries, schools of divinity, etc., to be able to put it on display. And it becomes the primary rationale for what I described in the very beginning as the wealth extraction from Black communities. And I mean, I keep coming back to that because one of the things we talk about in theological education is the amount of debt that so many students carry. And one of the things about debt is that that is money that is not available to invest in the well-being of our communities. And if students have received an education that only tangentially helps them deal with the issues of their community, while at the same time they'll spend the next 30 years paying for loans that are money that's not available to a community that doesn't have substantial intergenerational wealth, then what ends up happening is that there is a value to what they receive, but it's come at a grievous cost. Let's see, LaKesha, with the increase in interest in womenist studies, do you believe more women will pursue a theological education? I certainly think we've seen that rise because just in general population, and certainly in terms of African American and Black women from the diaspora, those numbers are continuing to climb. And I think that womanist thought, womanist studies is actually creating a space for them to see themselves and whatnot. I think that though that along with Black church studies, while being a critical part of any curriculum, because it not only normalizes the realities of Black women's existence, but does so in ways that view it as being worthy of theological reflection. But here again, unless the institution is significantly willing to invest itself in ensuring that the discrete and particular kinds of issues, challenges, insights, creativity that come from the existence of Black women, and it's only a course here and a course there, then we have some of the same issues that we've been talking about before. But once again, I think it's critically important that those are part of the curriculum. And I think that they are drawing certainly more women. But the challenge becomes, and here we want to connect two things, I think. The challenge becomes by answering the questions that arise within the Black church community and Black existence, we are then able, and having partnered with that community, we are then in a position to be advocates within the Black church on behalf of our Black women students. And we are able to call the Black church to accountability about issues of gender justice and gender oppression in ways that we can't call it to accountability if the only thing we have are tangential relationships, which are creating massive burdens of debt for clergy folk who are then unable to be adventurous in creating new communities, who are then unable to be adventurous in shaping new ministries because they have a $500 a month student loan debt. So, in doing that, what I want to suggest is that by doing all of this work, we're doing more than just having a course here or there, right? We're doing more than just having a womanist class or a womanist scholar. We're actually creating kinds of relationships so that we can address the experiences, the aspirations, and the creativity of Black women, both in terms of the Black church as well as in churches outside of our community, as well as in taking leadership roles in nonprofit work, as well as in political and cultural leadership. Let's see. How are these expansions of thought, Black studies, womanist ethics, womanist studies, Latinx studies, impact how white students are engaging, or do they avoid the diversity of thought? Well, LaKesha, I've taught at 4 seminaries now, and one of the issues, and that's largely why I think about things the way that I do, is that there will always be a discrete number, and they will never be more than a small or large minority of students that will take these courses in their own right. But if you ensure that in the courses that they have to take, that there is a way in which you can get the kind of engagement that creates the possibility for the work that I'm talking about. And that's one of the reasons why when I taught theology full time for 20 years, I always taught the intro to theology class. I always wanted to teach the introduction to theology class because I held then and I still believe that the way students learn to study theology in that class will shape every other class that they take. So whether or not they take a class in womanist studies, womanist ethics, or whether or not they take a class in Black liberationist theology or Latinx studies, the engagement with the issues that emerge from those fields of studies will shape how it is that they move in other spaces. Let's see, Solomon, should there be a concern that many whites are teaching African American church studies classes, in a word, becoming the authority on this study? You know, Solomon, that's a problem, but I think it's also one that becomes inescapable. And what I mean by that is that very many people are really, really surprised at the limited number of Black faculty, African American faculty, that teaches in schools of theology. A study that was done a number of years ago, maybe about 5 years ago now, that looked at the number of people who were teaching in these schools, found that Black people made up less than 5% of theological schools' faculty. But here's the other part that we don't get to, is that most of them are clustered in a few schools and in a few localities. So, what that means is that you are much more likely to find a seminary that doesn't have any Black faculty and a seminary that has three than you are to find anything else. So, what that means is that in most seminaries across the country, and this is particularly true with evangelical seminaries, there's not a single Black person on faculty teaching anything. So if it is going to be taught at all, it requires that someone who is not Black teach it. Now, there are problematic ways that they arise, but the question for us is it better that it not be taught at all? Or do we simply try to create resources and opportunities for people who are teaching it, who are not familiar with the experience, can actually become competent teachers of the discipline? So, I mean, it's a very real concern, but because of the sheer just demographics of the matter, the numbers of Black faculty in institutions of theological education are just so small. And I think we can lose sight of that because we see schools where there are a few people, where there are three or four people, and that really skews our view of how many people are actually out there in the world teaching. Let's see. Okay, so I mean, I think those are some great statements. I agree that CPE is necessary. Just to share a little story about that, Ed, when I was up at Yale Divinity School in the early '90s, when I was working with my committee on ministry, one of the arguments that we got into, and I mean, this was one of those arguments that may have seemed unwise, but I resisted taking CPE only because in the school that I was going to, the only opportunities for us to do CPE was to work in institutions and organizations that were serving almost exclusively the needs of white communities and white people, whether we're talking about CPE in terms of hospital work or in terms of nursing home work or in terms of other work. But the point was, I was clear with them that I think this is important work, but I'm not going to spend what's going to be required in terms of time, money, talent, as well as the other work that we need to do if there's no meaningful way that it's going to connect with and help and serve the community that I know I'm going to be serving. And we ended up coming to reshaping a particular kind of experience. But I think that you're exactly right, it's critically important. But what's also critically important is the cultivation of not only CPE supervisors, but also the cultivation of spaces in which Black people are doing more than suffering in trauma units, right? Because at least in terms of the places in which I've taught, where it was possible to engage in CPE that's specifically connected with the Black community, it was largely in spaces in which Black people were dealing with the trauma of violence as well as the other untoward effects of living within a racially oppressive society. And I mean, at some point, Black people do get old. Black people do go to nursing homes. Black people do create alternative communities. Black people do create days in the day programs for elders. And I mean, all of these kinds of programs. And so very few of our CPE programs either take those seriously or even try to find ways to connect with those. So I think those are important. So Yolanda Lowe, Why do several preachers devalue continuing education? Well, I think, that's what I've been trying to get at for a good bit of our conversation, Yolanda, is because they don't think it's helping them answer the questions of their community, either the existential questions around God's love in spite of the evidence of the material reality otherwise, or the kinds of questions about whose story of the church is the one that we ought to be shaped by and that we ought to be living with. So I think one of the reasons why many preachers devalue education is because they don't think it's helping them answer the questions of their people. But I do think that I don't think that's a reason why they should not, but I think that's the reason why they do not. So part of the challenge that we have as institutions, faculty members, et cetera, is to ensure that we are answering the questions. And I'm not saying we have to do it exclusively, but we have to do it in a meaningful way because that then allows them an experience that has value added to their formation in ministry and which they would value. And I think if more schools took that seriously, that we would find the resistance to theological education would decline substantially. Let's see. Our people are missing out on jobs in chaplaincy due to not being clinically trained through CPE. Yes, they are. They are. And I think that that's certainly a significant challenge, and where many of them, Brian, run into the problem, and this becomes an issue for seminaries, is that most models of CPE that currently exist are ones that require that people do the work in ways that are not financially feasible for them because they're asked to take substantial time away from their work. So, now CPE, and this is another whole conversation to have, is CPE as a project that exists within theological education is designed with the full-time student that has some material wealth that will allow them to engage in this program over this protracted period of time. And then, of course, you can add other units. What we need to do is to create a model which is shaped around the reality of bivocational ministers who are becoming increasingly the norm across mainstream Protestantism and have been largely the norm in Black churches, but the entire shaping of CPE would be different if the student that you were shaping the program for was bivocational. And as a consequence, had to do it in a way that would allow them to sustain both their ministry and whatever other vocation they were engaged in. Let's see, LaKesha. There's also such an over spiritualization of our walk as faith walkers. Yes. Let's see, Brian. Why do you think that many theological students don't focus on training in mental health with all of the mental health challenges that we are facing? That is a very good question. I mean, that is a huge question. There's a significant body of work, a significant group of people that are writing about that now. Nicholas Greer is one of them. He's one of my former students, and I know that Aaron Coley, who's a part of our call, is doing significant work. But I think one of the reasons, for that as well is that, Brian, our churches have become our spaces of therapy. And what I mean by that is that when you look at the role that worship plays, when you look at the role that the Friday night worship plays in the churches that still do that, those are spaces for therapeutic intervention. And I think that very many students who come to seminary shaped in that way, believing that and having experienced that the primary space in which Black people as a community engage in therapeutic activities is within the church. So, as a consequence, the idea that the church is doing and focusing on mental health apart from worship and apart from prayer and apart from Bible study is something that is sometimes a foreign idea to them. And so, part of what the whole issue of answering the questions that are being raised is that very important question: how do you engage mental health in a significant and important way while still giving honor to the therapeutic role that the church in its worship has played for Black people across generations? So you don't have to get rid of one, you can still honor it, but say we need to do more and we need to provide other opportunities. Dr. Trina Armstrong is doing significant amounts of work in that area. But I think that that's really at the core of it, is that recognizing what the church has always been for us, particularly in worship, but then also saying we need to do more. But we need to do more not because we respect what's happening in the church any less, but because if we're going to deal with this in a holistic fashion, then we are going to need to do both of these. I see we have 3 minutes. So if you have any other questions, I'm very, very happy to engage them. We have about 3 minutes left, but I really enjoyed engaging with you all. But if anybody has a question or a comment before we close this down so you can enjoy the rest of the conference, very happy to engage you. Okay, friends, thanks to all of you. Thanks for spending a bit of time with me, and I hope that the conversation has been helpful. And I also hope that, and I tell you, I've been enriched by your questions as well. So thank you so much, and you all be blessed. Take care. Bye-bye.